And we're live, virtually connecting at Digital Pedagogy Lab Toronto. I'm Joe Murphy. I'm your virtual buddy and the director of the Center for Innovative Pedagogy at Kenyon College. And we're connecting with Sean Michael Morris, and Rebecca Hogue, and Terry Green on site. And I'd like to ask our other virtual guests to introduce yourself. George and Company?
Okay, hi, I'm George Station. I'm a lecturer at Cal State Monterey Bay. And I'm working this spring with the office, the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Assessment. I usually teach lower division, social science, and technology classes, that kind of thing. This spring, I'm working with issues of sense of belongingness and community among lecturers as kind of an adjunctified class. And it's getting into some interesting discussions there. And that's why I'm here at the center today. And I'll pass it over to Dan.
Hi, I'm Dan Shapiro. I'm director of the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Assessment here at Cal State Monterey Bay.
And hi, I'm Vivian Waldrop-Patterson, and I'm an analyst in the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Assessment. Glad to be with you today.
Welcome. Glad you could join us. Greg?
I am Greg McVeary, and I'm in New Haven, Connecticut.
Hi, Greg. Jim?
I'm Jim Luke. I'm professor of economics at Lansing Community College, and also that's about half of my job now. The other half is I'm open learning faculty fellow in the Center for Teaching Excellence, and I'm trying just to make sure that I have way too much to do. I'm also trying to do a lot of research on the intersection of capitalism and the commons in higher education and institutional analysis thereof.
Nate?
And I'm Nate Angel. I'm coming to you from remarkably sunny Portland, Oregon, which isn't normally this way. I work with a nonprofit organization called Hypothesis that makes open source annotation technologies and practices. And happy to be here and join you all today at DigPed Lab Toronto.
Terrific. And on-site folks, Sean, Rebecca, would you say hi?
Okay, I'm Rebecca Hogue. I am a co-director of Virtually Connecting. I live in California, Sunnyvale, California, and I teach at UMass Boston, and I'm doing a PhD at U Ottawa. So I'm a global citizen. All right.
That's great. That's great. And I'm Sean Michael Morris. I'm the director of Digital Pedagogy Lab and the director of digital learning at the University of Mary Washington in Virginia, although I live in Portland, Oregon.
Cool.
And there's a Dave behind us.
There's a Dave behind us.
Hi, Dave. So I love to kick things off with the question, what are you guys learning at the conference?
What are we learning at the conference? That is such a difficult question to answer.
Which makes it sound like no one's learning anything. I'm learning that I need more help to run this thing. But
that's not nothing.
Yes, but actually, I mean, Digital Pedagogy Lab is so much about the learning that's generated by the people who come. So it's a lot less sort of front of the classroom back or top down kind of learning, and much more about what people bring to the table themselves. So we have got a course in digital storytelling. We've got a course in open pedagogy. I'm teaching a writing workshop, which has been fascinating because I didn't have any idea what people were going to bring in terms of their projects. And I'm working individually with everybody and kind of helping them work on different projects. Everything from fiction story to writing a report for their dean. I mean, like everything in between. So that's been really fascinating as well. We also have an inclusive design course and an intro to digital pedagogy course. And then Jesse Stommel is teaching radical assessment and ungrading. So there's a lot of variety, actually, of things that are going on here. We also had an amazing keynote from Rajiv Jangiani last night, which was just spectacular and is available on the website. And looking forward to a keynote tomorrow from Jess Mitchell from here in Toronto. So there's a lot of stuff going on in a very short period of time in a very small hotel.
A very interesting hotel, I tell you. It is very interesting. I am You know, I'm learning stuff about the people here as well. I'm doing the digital storytelling workshop, which is kind of fun. So I'm enjoying that, although I'm like, oh my God, I got so much to do before we do a little showcase tomorrow because things are not together yet. And it's amazing how much time it takes to just make your credits scroll over the screen, right? Or learning, you know, when you're playing with new tools, it can take forever. But the other thing I learned is that as hard as Sean tried, the institutions in which we work at are not the cities in which we live in, particularly eCampus Ontario, because they're all seconded. So none of them, almost none of them
in Toronto,
are in Toronto, right? Yeah, and calling Hamilton Toronto can be very problematic, even though I think it's a suburb of Toronto.
So everyone's name tags has on it, and I'm going to be wearing mine, has on it a city name, because I thought it would be clever to see the diversity of place that was located.
Well, you can't really see it, but there we go.
Ways, that looks good, yeah.
Yeah, and in some ways, Rebecca's diversity of place is reflected in the fact that it says Boston, and she's not in Boston, because you're kind of everywhere. So, but yeah, it was in many cases it went awry. But that's actually a learning experience. The event continues to grow and change as we move along. So,
well, I want to thank you because my wife is an unaffiliated scholar and has complained frequently about the reaction she gets at her conferences where they don't know what to do with someone without an institutional affiliation. So I think trying anything different gets you points. It might need even if it might need a 2.0. But
yeah, we've never included this institutional affiliation on the name badges because you have people from an R1 or a prestigious, Ivy League or what have you in the same group with someone from the community college, and there can suddenly be a power dynamic that wouldn't be there if they didn't know where each other was from. And so we just erase that piece of it. We want people to be able to come here as the individuals that they are, as the educators that they are, and the scholars that they are, and not have their institution affiliation be part of their identity necessarily, unless they want to claim it, and then it's theirs to claim, of course.
I'm curious. I've never actually attended any of the labs myself, unfortunately, and I hope to rectify that in the future. But so there have been quite a few of them. And does each have like its own unique flavor? And if so, what flavor would the Toronto chapter be?
I've been to 2 of them. So as a participant, I can tell you it's quite different because this is more condensed. And so in some ways, and people are more dispersed in where they're staying. Like in Fredericksburg, we were pretty much all in the same hotel, which meant that at breakfast time, we ran into, you could have breakfast with the presenter, with one of the leaders in the hotel, because we were all just in the hotel going downstairs for breakfast.
Right.
And that bit isn't really here as much, and so we're connecting more with the people in our cohorts, I guess is what we call them. They're smaller. Aren't they?
Yeah,
they're smaller groups. Yeah. And so, we're in this tiny room, and it's actually really funny because Chris can never figure out where he should be standing.
Right.
Because the room is so small.
This DPL is the first one we've ever held in a hotel. We normally hold them on institutional grounds. When we went, normally it's University of Mary Washington of Virginia is a big 5-day one. We've done a 3-day at the American University in Cairo, at Polytechnic University in Vancouver, and University of Prince Edward Island in Prince Edward Island. That gives different kinds of affordances because classrooms are classrooms, and so you have like all the great technology usually, and you've got bigger spaces and multiple ways to arrange a room. And when we came here, there's one projector, one TV, and there's these odd little rooms that are really fun and great, but then they provide these extra challenges. And that's actually been kind of fun because I think that people have embraced that challenge, and it's created a different kind of community. So the flavor, if you will, of this one is very analog. There's actually a lot more people interacting, I think, in terms of it's not about the technology we're working with, or even this. It's very place-based. It's very located in Toronto, and it's very focused on the individuals, the people who are here.
Just as a follow-up, does that mean that you would, sorry, George, I'll let you go. I was just going to say, does that mean you now see a value in holding them both at institutions and in other locations like this hotel, or are you tipping one way or the other for the future?
I am never holding one in a hotel again. No, I'm just joking. I would absolutely be open to another hotel. And I love the Gladstone Hotel where we are is amazing. People here the people who are working with us have been fantastic. The setting is gorgeous. And that means something, I think, to the participants, to have a really beautifully aesthetic kind of experience here. There's art in the hallways, there's gallery shows going on.
Take a look at the Gladstone Hotel website and look at the rooms.
Yes, the rooms
the pictures of the rooms.
Every room is individual.
Yeah, quite
and designed by a local artist. So it's a fascinating place to have this event. There's complications that I didn't foresee. So if we were going to do it at a hotel again, I would have learned something.
So what you're saying about the venues is interesting. In one of the earlier conversations, people from the inclusive design track were present, and I think that they're having a continuing conversation on inclusive design versus, whether that's in quotation marks or not, versus UDL, Universal Design for Learning.
Oh, interesting.
So they're basically really tackling that as far as differences, similarities, where do those two notions cooperate and where they clash. At least that's where. So I'm thinking, and is it is Amy? Is that her track, or is that?
Yeah, Amy Collier.
So I'm thinking that, because my brain, as you know, goes like global to global again, bounces back and forth all the time. But so I was thinking that your post conversation might be just about that aspect of things. What's working in this hotel space that might be, are there elements to bring to Fredericksburg, or as you maybe suggested, leave behind forever and don't do this anymore. But Amy's cohort or track may have some ideas about that might be worth sussing out from, and that's just from the earlier conversation.
That's a really good point. And actually, I just saw people from Amy's track going around the hotel and kind of looking at its accessibility
lack
stuff,
thereof,
or lack thereof, and sort of looking at it from a design perspective. How has it been designed, and what could be changed to make it more inclusive? And Amy's good at that. She actually once did that with Digital Pedagogy Lab itself at Digital Pedagogy Lab, taking the lab apart and saying, how is it designed? How can it be designed better? And it was really useful to us, because to hear that kind of critical feedback about how it was designed was really, really helpful for the following year. Yeah, that's actually something to keep in mind then, if we were to have it at a hotel again, is to be walking through the hotel, looking at the rooms from an inclusive design standpoint. How is the hotel set up for this particular event? And that certainly was a consideration. I came to visit the hotel last October, and to see the spaces, and that was definitely a consideration.
The elevator is from 1907.
Yeah.
And has to be operated by one of the staff.
Wow.
To follow up on that, I think it's interesting. You're making me think about the effect the facility has on the thinking.
Yes.
And how folks interact with each other. I'm just the last 2 years I was struck when I went to OER in the UK, and both years it was held at a non-academic, non-hotel setting. I don't even know if we have these things in the US. They were like nonprofit organizations that made meeting space kind of things available.
Wow.
And so it really changed the dynamic of how you interacted with people and thought about things.
Convention centers.
Yeah, convention center would be probably the closest thing. Here, the writing workshop that I'm teaching, for example, is actually in the back of the bar. There's a little area where there's tables set up and stuff, and it's a place for gathering, like it is, but it's open to the bar, and you can see the bar and you can hear people, eating lunch and that sort of thing. And but as a writing workshop, it actually seems really perfect because
you getting a lot of Hemingway type stuff coming out?
No, unfortunately not. The bar's actually not open while we're in town. Oh. But I mean, lunch is like people can have their lunch and that sort of thing in there. But yeah. But the setting is really interesting. There's like chairs, and it's a different kind of. It's not classroom at all, and so it has affected, I think, the way that people have interacted with each other and the kinds of ways that they've been able to tuck into their own writing there, where they wouldn't necessarily be able to do that in a formal, more classroom space. It would feel more like I needed to be directing them more. And in this case, I can go do your thing, like go hang out and write. And there's places to do that feel writerly, if you will. Yeah.
I wonder, I know George has some sort of newish folks to this conversation maybe. And I'm wondering if, and maybe I should put this back to you guys that are with George, but do you guys feel like you understand why DigPed Lab exists and what it does? And if not, Sean would be the perfect person to ask.
I had no ulterior motives in either the timing or anything else, or the space choice or anything, except that it was totally with that intent in mind, to be honest. Because you can share the website all you want, which I've already done. All I wanted. And it's like, oh, Sean's actually going to be in one of the hangouts. So if it worked with the time difference and everything, I was hoping that maybe a more general question about the lab would pop up. So over to whoever may have a question.
I mean, in terms of what I have your website open right now and just read about, and it seems to explain fairly clearly what the purpose is, which I think is great.
Well, I think something that's interesting that came up in our session, because it wasn't quite explained right away, is the pedagogy that's used within the session. And because I think people expected more specific direction at first until they were told how the students shape the pedagogy. And I wonder if you want to talk more about that conscious choice.
Sure. I mean, Digital Pedagogy Lab was founded. Oops, I just moved the whole world. It was founded after Jesse Stumble and I had worked for a long time on the journal Hybrid Pedagogy. And we were coming at the idea of professional development from a critical pedagogy standpoint. So a Freirean sort of standpoint. In terms of helping people get to a place where they are able to read their world sort of critically, to understand the systems that are influencing their work, and certainly in institutions that's ever present, but even in smaller ways. Like in the writing workshop, for example, we're working with the idea of how do we even subconsciously conform to writing standards, so that we are, and then we're, but in that process, suppressing or oppressing our own voice. And so we start talking about that. So we start looking critically at expectations around writing, for example. The next step of that then is to work around the idea of agency, and we have the power to intervene and to change. And that's a big piece of what we are here for. Digital Pedagogy Lab has absolutely open politics. We are not a neutral organization. We believe in a progressive education that's founded in critical pedagogy, and so we work everything. We do everything we can to teach the courses that way, so that students are centered. In this case, faculty, administrators, librarians, instructional designers, anyone in education, K-12 teachers as well, come to the lab and they become centered in that space. So that they're exploring these issues on their own and in their own way, with someone in the room who is not a guide on the side and not a sage on the stage, but someone who is comfortable in that field enough to be able to answer questions, push them further, to get them asking other questions, and then hopefully construct some things so that when they walk away, when they go home, they can go home with some idea of how to change systems that are not working for them. Even in small ways, in the little ways, like in the ungrading course, for example, new ways of grading or not grading that even would work within a system where grades are necessary. And so that's really what we're after. Is empowering teachers to make change, empowering educators to make change within education, and to sort of call us into sort of the present moment in terms of what's happening with social justice within education and outside of education, how we can be influences on that as well.
So can you give me some examples of what that would look like in a digital classroom?
Oh, so yeah, so in digital, and I totally ignored the whole digital part of our digital pedagogy lab. So
you have often done that, though. You lead with the pedagogy, right? And then,
right.
Yeah.
Right, which is appropriate because in our idea, digital pedagogy is not about the digital, it's about the pedagogy within a digital context. So when we talk about digital pedagogy, we're talking about classroom pedagogy or online pedagogy as it's inflected by the fact that we live in a digital world. So it's not necessarily online learning. It's not necessarily just digital learning. The writing workshop, for example, we're not talking about digital at all. We're talking about pedagogy, and we're talking about life as an academic. So we're talking about professionalism and all of that as well. And that necessarily becomes inflected by digital because people are at their laptops, people are talking about how they present themselves on social media. The writing workshop, for example, has been talking about blogging. How do we blog? Do we decide to promote ourselves on Twitter? What kind of presence do we have in social media? All of that is related to how we write as academics. And so it naturally blossoms out because we live in a digital world. In the case of like the assessment and ungrading, the radical assessment and ungrading course, Jesse is working with both classroom practice and also online practice. So how do we work with students in an ungrading situation where we're not going to be grading them? And then what happens when that student is someone you never meet? And what are the different kinds of tensions that arise when you're trying to change policies that they're accustomed to and policies that are ingrained within the design of the LMS, for example? How do you respond to that? So all of that it's all, for us, it's a continuum of pedagogy from pure analog with a chalkboard all the way to digital. It's all encompassing.
And so when you work with faculty or you work with students on these kinds of approaches and issues, what kinds of things come up?
Oh.
I mean, a lot of what you're talking about is very kind of abstract out here. I'm just trying to help ground the reality of what.
So give me an example. So if we were talking about, well, let me try to think of an example. A specific example, and hopefully this is specific enough, in like the inclusive design track that Amy Collier is teaching. A lot of that is going to be involved with talking about online learning and what happens in an LMS, in an online space where you don't need a student. So part of it is going to be talking about, well, what do you do in a discussion forum to create inclusion, to make sure that people are feeling welcomed, feeling like it's an equitable space. What kinds of direct practices can you put in play for that to happen? But included in that, no pun intended, but included in that is the idea of where is erasure taking place, which is a larger concept. Where is erasure taking place even within the construct of the LMS? How are students' names and voices being erased? One of the things that comes up often in inclusive design when we're speaking about online learning is trans voices or trans students who often have names they've chosen, but they're not names that show up on a roster. So a teacher in an online setting where they're never going to meet their student are given these names on the roster. They can't usually change them. But a student may say, well, my name, I go by this, but that's not going to change in the roster. So what kind of erasure is taking place place there? And that's an important question. And how do you reach out to that student and make sure they feel like they're included, even though their grade is going to be reflected on a different name? So that sort of thing is that a sort of more specific?
Yeah, no, that helps. That definitely helps.
Yeah, okay, sure.
I can add one that I don't think actually I've discussed with Dan and Vivian yet, at least not too deeply. Just something like the concept of annotation, and I'll just use hypothesis as an example, and you know, Nate can jump in with another opinion if he doesn't like how I'm using hypothesis or something. But that hasn't happened yet. But because everybody wants students to annotate, that's kind of a given. You know, it's like, it's great to read, it's great to annotate so that students can reflect and say what, you know, they're thinking about a piece, that sort of thing. But bringing the digital into it specifically in the form of social annotation, where they're not just handing that annotation into an instructor and nobody else ever sees it, or maybe like their small group, if they're working in a small group, they see it, but nobody else ever sees it, right? And you know, eventually somebody's going to evaluate and put some kind of a grade on it. It changes the conversation just by using that tool that is more expansive and in some sense inclusive, and in a way more public, right? Choosing to be more public with your annotations changes the style, changes the interaction between students, changes, you know, how students express themselves. So that alone is a specific example that's grown out of just the whole digital pedagogy conversation.
And to continue, I'm sorry, but to continue that point, actually, so at Digital Pedagogy Lab, we would never, and I like hypothesis, so I'm just going to say that. I also don't like hypothesis, so I'm going to say that. But at Digital Pedagogy, we would never let a tool just lay there and say it's good or not good. Hypothesis it can be more inclusive. It can also be just as much a vehicle for erasure. It can be a place where people are forming community. It can be a place where people are bullied. It can be public writing can be really beneficial to students. It can also be really detrimental to students. And so looking at both sides of that, always being critical of what we're looking at, is incredibly important. And then knowing that we're going to make a decision based on that, on what we've evaluated. There's no necessarily right answer, except in certain cases like return it in, there's a right answer, don't use it. But Hypothesis, for example, is a wonderful company. Like, they actually do a lot of really good work, and they're good people, and their product is aimed in a good way. But it's not perfect. It's not perfect. And so, yeah.
I would add, I removed Hypothesis this semester from my classes to be more inclusive. Mainly because it was just too much tool overload that was causing anxiety for my students, because it was like, oh, you need to sign up for this WordPress site, you need to sign up for the Slack site, you need this annotation, and they're going from never taking an online class to me being like, no, I'm only teaching online in HTML only. There's no LMS, there's no, and that in itself is not that, that's a risk, that's erasure, but it's also a tool that I have. So I was just like, how can I eliminate some tools? So I got rid of Slack, and I put a chat room on my website, and I got rid of Hypothesis, even though I love it, because first, at an even more meta level, I don't want to dictate how you do your external storage. 50% of my students, if not more, still want to print out a 100-page PDF because they want the PDF. Like, so I don't want to say you can't. That's your way of external storage. I might use a commonplace book theory on my website, but you don't have to. So yeah, it was hard for me, because this is the first time I'm not teaching with Hypothesis, but it was just, I felt it brought in too much anxiety for my kids to have just one more thing to check, one more thing to do. I think students maybe bring it back, but yeah, that's my kind of thing.
And I think that's right. I think that, so Hypothesis is great in the wild. I love Hypothesis in the wild. I like it on the internet, and I think it's fantastic. They have an integration with Canvas, and I don't know if they have an integration with other LMSs, but they have an integration with Canvas. And the problem with the integration with Canvas is that matches hypothesis with the gradebook. And so all of a sudden, hypothesis annotations are graded, and they're turned in like assignments, and they're often turned in without context. So they don't have necessarily next to them all the rest of the context that conversation came from. And then all of a sudden, students are no longer forming community in hypothesis. They're just responding to an assignment. They're thinking, like, what does the teacher want me to say? I'm going to say it here because that's going to. And then hypothesis itself is just ruined. That's not what it's for. And so I like it. Like I said, I like it in a lot. But I also really respect the idea of keeping tools to a minimum. If that's an accessibility issue for students, if they feel intimidated by too many tools, yeah, eliminate the tools.
I feel like I should just say something since we're suddenly talking about hypothesis. I totally agree with everything.
I apologize to everybody for veering it off that tangent, but bring it back anytime.
Well, this is actually all very much an example of what happens at Digital Pedagogy Lab. So it actually works, yeah. I
mean, I think the first thing I would just agree with most wholeheartedly is we shouldn't let tools dictate pedagogy, right? I mean, we should always be putting the people first, and if tools serve us well in certain pedagogical situations, then that's great. And if they don't, then, and that situation may be incredibly local to an individual student or something, you know, like the student that Greg says needs to print out their PDF. So yeah, I mean, that is the most important takeaway from all of this. And no tool, I mean, like you say, Sean, I can't imagine an environment where Turnitin would become a positive tool, but there's no tool that is going to be wholly positive in every single case, right? And so, and it's all these balances that, you know, between the, you know, for Greg, hypothesis having another login was a barrier. And yet then when we integrate it with the LMS so that there's single sign-on, suddenly other things crop up, like possibly a tighter you know, link to the gradebook, which is not actually required, just so you know. But anyway, so I just thumbs up to all of you guys said. We don't want to make this a hypothesis-only conversation.
Well,
it's a DigiPed conversation because there's a lot of things there. Like until the private groups, like I would love to have them annotate publicly. The same reason I never will ever make anybody join Twitter. Like, I'm not going to say you have to give your data away. Twitter will take your data.
Right.
And I'm never going to say that you have to put something in the public domain. And unless I do a private group, like, you're in the public domain. And so I feel like I don't have a right as an instructor to tell my students how to license their work. And so that's one of the reasons. Like, once the private groups launched, and I talked to Jared, like, I worked with John in piloting this. The private group features are great. But at the same time, I wish like there was licensing controls, because I guess it's just a lot of my own personal hangups on like how I treat student data, like privacy through data empowerment. As long as like I want them to control everything they own. My university doesn't, but I do.
But there's a lot to be said for the cognitive load associated with it, which is what you were talking about, Greg. And it's one of the problems I've run into even with the private groups, and then my students accidentally post to the public because they don't realize they have to click the button.
Yep.
And so inevitably, again, it just becomes a cognitive load. And unless there's a pedagogical reason for using the tool, and an intent behind it, then it's just another tool.
But I'd like to jump in on that. And this is kind of related to the blog post you did today, Sean, which I guess is your remarks there.
Oh, yeah. Morning, yeah.
Yeah, it's also indicative. We need to be, this is digital pedagogy issue, and we have a tendency, and by we, I'm talking about teachers, professors, to take the tools there and focus just on the tools. I think it's critically important to look not just at the tools, but also look at the organizations behind it, the business models, and those values. For example, I'd love, as a tool, I love Slack. I would dearly love to do that with some stuff in class. I haven't done that yet because I know that, yeah, right now it's okay with Slack, but all the incentives are wrong. Slack someday is going to do mass integration and of data and stuff. You know, Canvas started out fine, but they can't resist. You know, they can't resist. I mean, that's the model. So, I'm looking at things like, well, we need to do, I'm looking at self-hosted Mattermost instead of doing Slack. But, and there's more work. Huh?
No, IRC, it still works. IRC.
But, but then when you start talking about different self-hosted tools, then, it's, if you're you're either putting the burden on the students of multiple logins and all that stuff, well, that could be technologically solved with lots of API and coordination and integration. But again, that's the burden on us. And that's why we've got to work harder as professors to integrate and cooperate and share, tweaks, integrations of stuff. It's real tempting to just retreat into our own classroom.
Sure, yeah, and I think that's where I was getting at when I to bring it back around to Digital Pedagogy Lab when I talk about sort of the social justice issues in education,
yes,
and how we affect those both in the classroom and outside the classroom, outside the institution, even because we have to be aware of those. We have to be aware of this isn't just a problem in your classroom. This is a problem that is being brought into your classroom by the technology, or these are issues being brought in by your students who've had certain kinds of experiences in life, who come from certain intersectional positionalities in culture, and we have to be able to respond to all of those. So, like I said, like this conversation is exactly the kind of thing that takes place at Digital Pedagogy Lab all the time, because this is the part where we read the world. This is the part where we talk about what's actually going on. And my opening remarks, thank you for reading my blog post. My opening remarks yesterday were all about that. They were all about, okay, we got to be careful here. We're not reading carefully enough. Let's read carefully, because if what we do is just go ahead and sign up for Canvas again as an institution, what we're now consigning our students' data to someone who's going to be making AI to change our pedagogies over time. And we have no control of what they decide to do with that data, none at all. So they're just doing whatever they would like to do, whatever seems like the best business venture. And I was a fan of Canvas. I worked there, for goodness sakes. And but we have to be very careful. We have to be very, very mindful about what's actually happening. And these are issues that go beyond the whole idea of AI, for example. It naturally is going to privilege the people who are the coders. It's going to privilege the cultures that they come from, because that's where they're coming from. That's their intersectionality. That's their positionality in culture. So, do we have enough women? Do we have enough Black women? Do we have enough people of color generally doing that coding? So, is it going to be sensitive to people who are coming from those positions? Probably not. So, those are all issues that we need to be talking about, and those conversations can begin here. One of the most important things that we do here, though, is we really try to point people toward the intervention piece. How can we intervene? How can we make change? Yeah. How can we take small actions, big actions, whatever it looks like? What's possible for you when you get home?
Maybe I'm even being paranoid. I'm like, with the as XAPI is going to come onto the scene and connect all these and like supposedly be this was funded by the DoD. Now it uses a type of metadata that's broken up to subject, object, subject, verb, object. What kind of language uses subject, verb, object? The DoD. Granted, and I'm not going to get into the whole RDFA debate, but that is how. But if that's how we're going to define metadata based on English, that's not an inclusive web. Right. So, like, that's XAPI scares me a little bit.
No, I think this is an interesting question, because when you were talking about the things that you bring to your class, the things that tech brings to your class, I think one of the really interesting issues is the ability of someone else to bring something into the ability of another instructor to bring something in that is now in your class. Because, certainly from my perspective as a center director and instructional technologist and a librarian once upon a time, we know that the best way to change faculty behavior is to change student expectations. When the students show up saying, "Can't we do it this way?" is when faculty members say, "Well, that sounds interesting," and they need to be equipped with the ability to have that conversation. So I guess this is the long and rambling way of me saying I think it would be interesting to hear more about thoughts how it comes home, and what's the venue at home where a conversation that starts at a DPL or in another similar venue can continue.
Yeah, and there's different examples of that. There's a lot of people who leave DPL, and I hear from them after, and they're like, I left so full of hope and so charged, and I got home and everything was just the disaster it always was, and I didn't know what to do. And then there's more and more I'm encouraging groups from institutions to come, because when a group comes and then they go home, they can actually begin to do something because they stay in touch with each other, and they can start to actually make some change. We've had groups from probably the biggest success story actually from DPL is a group from the University of Colorado at Denver. And that included Brad Hinson and Remy Collier and some other folks who are familiar with this community. They came to DPL a couple of years ago, and they brought a group, about 10 people. And we sat with them, and they talked about how can we bring this home. And then they went home, and they talked, and their dean was with them as well. And so they went home, they talked about getting a grant, they got a grant, they started a new group there. And called Think Studio, and now they're like running programs that have all to do with the work that they learned that they started doing at DPL, and they're now in their like second year, and they keep coming back to DPL for more charge and more ideas, but they're actually now starting to do their own thing, and they've really started doing this work, and that's pretty tremendous. That's pretty great. There's also a group from the University of Alabama who's come a couple of times, and they're a smaller group, but they went back and they started really petitioning people and talking about, they have like a faculty senate type of conference thing that happens on campus, and they've started moving that more in a digital or critical pedagogy way. And that's a smaller change. They don't have a foundation, they don't have an organization, they're not holding events, but they're actually sort of starting to push the conversation. And those, a lot of times those rely on groups. But sometimes an individual can go home and make a big difference too.
Cool. Well, you've been very generous with your time there on site, and everybody has been very generous with their time in the conversation. But we are running late. I guess I'll put out a call for any closing final thoughts. It's a comedian who used to say, any questions, any answers, anybody?
I like that. I'm going to have to use that. I guess I would just say that anyone watching, like this, and I'm going to point out one thing too that might make everybody uncomfortable. But anybody watching, this is like I said, the kind of conversation that goes on at DPL, and DPL is open to everyone. We do everything that we possibly can to make the event accessible. It is an on-ground event. We do often have virtually connecting present, so there's this virtual component to it. But we don't do a lot of virtual work otherwise because we believe very much in the cohort model with people on ground talking to each other. It's a kind of learning that can't really happen online in the same way. But we also have, at most DPLs, a fair bit more diversity than is presented in this particular group.
We have to put all three hangouts together from DPL Toronto. If you put all three together, you got it. To be blunt, it's like I don't know what to do with Jim, but Jim keeps showing up.
I'm a pain.
Jim's great. But yes, we do try. We have worked very hard over the last several years to make it a more inclusive space. And so and the conversations are generally led by people from all different kinds of intersectional positions.
I would just throw in, and from my experience last summer with DigPed and everything you've done since then, it's one thing. I mean, we get hit with a lot of stuff about trying to be inclusive and all that other stuff, but probably the most powerful part of being a DigPed was you model it so well. Boosting the signal, bringing all the other voices in, both being conscious about it, but just modeling it and in everyday conversations. And that makes it a lot easier to come back and, I'm trying to be reform. I'm an old white guy, but it makes it easier to come back and do that at home.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that that's how it feels there. That's exactly what we hope for.
Yeah. But the very structure of the DPLs is really important, and it's visible. It's there over the last few years. I mean, I love the lineup this year, but over the last few years as well. Just noting that it's intentional and it's not an accident. It's not just this is just who happens to wander through either Madison or Fredericksburg or whatever. Right? It's very intentional and it shows. It's appreciated.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, that sounds like a good note to end on. Hopeful and challenging at the same time. Good pedagogy there. So thank you, everybody, for a fantastic conversation. And this is Virtually Connecting, signing off till next time.